Hello everyone, welcome back to our House Call series, From Confusion to Clarity. Today we're continuing our discussion with Follow the Science. Barry, we'll just pick this up again from our last video. Many people get the sense that science, being very logical, is actually therefore very boring, and that it lacks passion, or that our emotions get in the way. But is this really true?
Well, a lot of people have that impression, but in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Passion, strong emotion is like the fuel for science. And I do the analogy of the rocket ship. You need really explosive fuel if you're going to reach the heavens, but if you don't control it well, you're just going to blow up on the launch pad. So we need a balance of that passion with our upper brains, the rational thought, if we want to be successful in science, particularly utilizing the right side of our brain, which is the side we tend to be more creative with.
You know, sometimes, like as human nature, we have moments of great clarity, right? We have radical shifts in paradigm thinking. But more often than not, we usually kind of inch our way to the truth, right? It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so just like unchecked emotions, there's no place for rigid thinking in all of this right now.
Yeah, and I think, you know, delving into dogmatism, character assassination, ad hominem attacks, and there's no place for that in science, and it's seldom helpful. I mean, we have to remember that science is not about beliefs, it's not about consensus, it's about using our brains and thinking to find explanations that explain the world better and make better predictions. So, as they say, be tough on the problem, but soft on each other. At the end of the day, we know that all interventions can do harm. The trouble is that we don't always know who's going to be harmed and how much. I mean, if we did, like with thalidomide, we'd avoid that harm. If they had just known that the unborn fetus would not tolerate this medication, they would have made a warning to say, don't take it in pregnancy. But we don't always know. So in order to try to move ahead, when we have to look at risk, we try to limit the use of a drug or intervention to only those people who will benefit a lot and avoid those people who may be harmed. So that's why it takes many years sometimes to develop a drug or a vaccine or a surgical therapy, for example, identify whether it's effective, who is effective for, and who should not undergo the specific intervention. So, example again, thalidomide is very good for treating leprosy, provided that you don't give it to pregnant women. We know, for example, that penicillin is a great antibiotic, but you shouldn't give it to people who are known to be penicillin allergic. The trouble is we don't always know before someone develops a serious allergic response to penicillin that they will react to it in that way. If we did, of course, we'd avoid it, but sadly, it's not always predictable, and therefore not all harm can be avoided entirely.
You know, we're talking risk versus benefit. And so I think about the many policies that were instituted during COVID, and a lot of them don't make sense to me. Like, for example, you have to wear masks to get into a restaurant, and then once you're seated down, you take them off. And then there's the whole issue of the plexiglass. Is it doing anything to prevent the transmission of the virus, or is it actually making it worse by preventing proper airflow? And then if you think about sports organizations, if you watch them on TV, you'll see that the players are not wearing them when they're on the bench or when they're playing, but they'll wear masks in the dressing room. Same thing for coaches. Coaches are wearing them on the benches, but the players are not. And then, you know, there's always I question the science behind mandating mask use outdoors, and especially when, you know, I'm seeing somebody outside jogging with a mask on. To me, that's actually doing more harm to that person than good. So where's the science in that? Well,
I certainly agree with you that I really question the science behind a lot of the interventions we've done. I think there's been a lot of inconsistencies during COVID. At the end of the day, there's always going to be harm to any intervention, no matter how well intended, no matter how much there may be benefit for it. But I think we've kind of got wrapped up in this forest and trees business. We get so focused on the tree called COVID that we can't stand back and take a forest picture and see, is there any harm that we're doing in the process of focusing on this one tree called COVID? So, for example, some people may not be at all bothered by social isolation. Other people may be devastated by it. Some people may not mind wearing masks, but it may be that for children who are in the developmental phase, socially, physically, emotionally, psychologically, masks might be quite harmful to them. We've talked already about how some people will be harmed by vaccines, others will benefit from it. We know that not everybody has suffered the same way financially. Some people may be better off than they were, but many people have lost their jobs or businesses, and poverty rarely produces better health. It usually produces ill health. I felt sorry during the pandemic for people battling substance abuse. They've often needed that contact, whereas a lot of people might have been very happy to work from home. So there's going to be a differential effect on these measures varying from person to person. We're not all the same. At the end of the day, we're all unique. The processes we use will change, will be different, have different effects on all of us. In other words, one size does not fit all.
Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned businesses like, you know, so there's a measure that's imposed, and if we use a business as an example, you have to shut down for the greater of society. Mm-hmm. And so while society is being protected, there's that business owner and his staff. I mean, they're not getting any revenue. They're going out of business. There are a lot of harms that are being caused by these measures. And so, but if we think about our conversations and we think about critical thinking, you know, I'd like to think that we use critical thinking, or we've shown that if you think that way, if you think critically, and you know, we're replacing debate with dialogue, right? And we are avoiding binary thinking, and we use these ethical principles that we've talked about, and such as transparency and truth-telling, that it will all help mitigate, you know, the inevitable harms that come with all interventions. Because all interventions have benefits, but they all have harms.
Yeah, I think the other thing we have to be wary of is conflict of interest. And conflicts of interest are any time we're unduly influenced, either consciously or subconsciously, for a certain outcome. We're biased to have a certain result occur, then that is potential for conflict of interest. So we often think conflict of interest means financial or monetary conflict of interest, but it could also be emotionally. We're invested in something, not just financially, or we're invested in it in terms of our reputation, for example. So we have a tendency sometimes to spin the narrative, or in other words, make the data fit the lens as opposed to the lens fit the data, like we spoke of earlier. If we're invested in a certain belief, then certainly science can sometimes be a victim of that conflict of interest. I mean, there are 7 billion people on the planet. There's going to be significant profit if every single one of them must be given a vaccine for which there's a significant profit per dose, as opposed to if we only use treatment for those who are sickest, where there's only millions, not billions of people, and the profit per dose, for example, of a repurposed drug, it's much less than for a brand new vaccine. That's a big conflict of interest. And so new vaccines may be much more profitable than using repurposed drugs. That's the conflict. Equally, the Canadian government has assumed the liability for these vaccines, but the trouble is the same government that is going to assume liability for them is also the one monitoring harm. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they won't do a good job, but obviously there's a potential conflict of interest there if you're both monitoring the possible harm and then having to pay liability for that harm. It doesn't guarantee there'll be a conflict of interest, but I think it makes us worried that science and ethics might lose out in the process. And
you know, you mentioned about the Canadian government assuming the liability. Like, I'm not sure who owns the liability. Is it the vaccine makers, the manufacturers, or will it be the Canadian government, or will it be the people, you know, instituting these policies? Somebody, one of those three, you know, bodies have got to assume liability, right? We talked about conflict of interest. That is a major bias that you covered. Another one is the misuse of statistics. And again, I know that we're kind of repeating this, but it's important to remind people. So when we say misuse of statistics, let's talk about the deaths, for instance, right? Again, that they're lumping it all into one total. That's sort of, it's misuse because it's not properly done, it's not understood. We're thinking that it's one total when it should have been broken down into 3 years now. And then there's the classifications of death, right? If they're unethical or if they're ethical.
Yeah, I think that, you know, we assume a death as a death, but I think it's probably fair to say that not all deaths are the same. A 25-year-old who dies from an adverse reaction to a vaccine loses 60 years of life. Most people who have died of COVID are elderly and are losing far less than 60 years of life, and often only a few years of life. So years of life lost might be a more useful tool for really describing the full impact that our interventions are having with respect to battling COVID. And again, the side effects of the vaccine, at least so far, seem to reside more with younger people, whereas the deaths from the virus itself seem to reside more in the elderly. And unfortunately, doctors have been, encouraged or perhaps even threatened to maintain the present narrative. So they're not really allowed to go off script. They're not really able to say anything against any intervention, any measure, anything against vaccines, masking, other mandates, social isolation, etc. And they're not allowed to talk about alternative treatments as opposed to just talking about the vaccine. I remember early on in the COVID, I was able to have pretty open scientific discussions with colleagues of mine about various aspects of the pandemic. But now, whenever I speak to them, it's basically, look, everyone's got to get vaccinated. It's the only way out. And if I bring up my confusion or the inconsistencies or discrepancies, I'm shut down. We can't talk about them anymore. That worries me.
So you live in Quebec, and so in April 2020, I always have to stop and think what year this is. In April 2021, just this past year, the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons issued actually a gag order on their doctors. I don't know if you know that. We put that on our website, and I'll put the link in the description below. But the gag order is exactly what you had just mentioned. They said that physicians are not allowed to speak out against the public health narrative. If they do, there's going to be consequences. And the December before that, so then December 2020, the same, gag order came to nurses from their college, their licensing body. So, again, it kind of goes back to what we had said before. If we can't question, science is all about questioning things. And if we can't question the science and we're being penalized for it or gag order on it, then that's not very scientific.
And it's a common ploy in medicine to manipulate statistics. So, for example, a very common thing to have done is to use RRR, relative risk reduction, instead of absolute risk reduction. Now, for example, suppose that there's a disease and you have a 30% chance of getting it, and I have a 3% chance of getting it. If you take a certain intervention, say a drug, we could reduce your risk from 30% to 20%. If I took it, I could reduce my risk from 3% to 2%. So your relative risk reduction is from 30% to 20% is a 10% drop. 10 of 30 is this 33% relative risk reduction. Mine goes from 3 to 2, 1 out of 3. That's also 33%. So that's the relative risk reduction for me is also 33%. But clearly, your absolute risk reduction is 10% from 30 to 20. Mine, despite having the same relative risk reduction, goes from 3 to 2. The way we're going to look at those drugs is going to be very different if we look at the absolute risk reduction as opposed to simply the relative risk reduction. And it's interesting, for the Pfizer vaccine, the relative risk reduction was 95%. Sounds pretty impressive. But when you find out the absolute risk reduction was actually 0.84%, not nearly so impressive. And that actually had to do with simply attack rates from the virus. That did not include deaths. And the reason for that is that the studies were too small and the studied subjects were so healthy that there were so few deaths they could not actually make any statements about the absolute or relative risk reduction in deaths, not just in cases. So one of the numbers that gets generated from absolute risk reduction is the number needed to treat. How many people must be treated in order to get one positive result? The number needed to treat for the Pfizer vaccine is over 100. In other words, you have to treat over 100 people to eliminate one case of COVID. Not one death of COVID, just one case of COVID. And again, the original studies could not tell us the number needed to treat to prevent one death because the studies were underpowered. They had too few people, and again, studied for too short a period of time. Equally, there's also a thing called number needed to harm, NNH, and that means how many people do you treat before you see one harm. we have no idea what that is. Because to really know what that is, we have to not just do passive surveillance like we're doing now for side effects, you have to do active for surveillance, and we have not been doing that. So we know the number needed to treat is quite high. We have no idea what the number needed to harm is. Both of those things should concern us.
You know, I'm learning so much every time we sit and we have these discussions. And so it comes down to context. And if the statistics aren't clearly explained, and if they are not clearly explained, I'll just say it like that, then it becomes a misuse of those statistics, because people are going to interpret them in whatever way that they would believe it to be true, or whatever they think it is. It's very dangerous when you have this misrepresentation of statistics, actually.
You know, part of the trouble is like we said before, you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
So the public may not know the questions to ask. They would not know that RRR and ARR, relative risk reduction and absolute risk reduction, exist, that they're both very different, and that absolute risk reduction is probably a more useful number for most people than relative risk reduction. But if you don't know that you don't know to ask those questions.
Well, you see, that's why we're having conversations with you, because I don't know what I don't know. And the majority of people, unless we are in the healthcare field or a scientist, we don't know what we don't know, right? Do you have any other thoughts on?
I think that's all for now, but I think we have a whole bunch of stuff to talk about in our next and last video on Follow the Science.
Okay. Thank you for today. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Paula.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.